The first snow of the season had begun to fall, blanketing the small town in a soft, shimmering white. The rooftops of houses were dusted with snow, and the trees stood tall, their branches adorned with delicate icicles that glistened in the pale winter sunlight. The air was crisp and cold, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of pine and the faint aroma of wood smoke from chimneys. It was the beginning of December, and the festive spirit of Christmas was already starting to fill the air. In a cozy little house at the edge of town lived Buddy, a golden Labrador with a heart as warm as the fireplace that crackled in the living room. Buddy was no ordinary dog. He was the kind of companion who could sense every emotion of his family, always ready to comfort them with a wag of his tail or a gentle nuzzle. His golden fur was thick and soft, perfect for the cold winter days, and his big brown eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. Buddy was not just a pet, he was a beloved member of the family. Buddy's family consisted of the Johnsons, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, their 10-year-old daughter Lily, and their 7-year-old son Jack. The Johnsons adored Buddy, and he adored them in return. He was Lily's confidant, Jack's playmate, and Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's loyal protector. Buddy had been with the family since he was a puppy, and over the years he had become an inseparable part of their lives. As the snow continued to fall outside, the Johnson household was buzzing with activity. Christmas was just around the corner, and the family was busy preparing for the holiday season. The living room was a flurry of decorations with boxes of ornaments, strings of twinkling lights, and rolls of colorful wrapping paper scattered across the floor. The scent of freshly baked cookies wafted from the kitchen, where Mrs. Johnson was busy icing gingerbread men while humming a cheerful Christmas tune. Buddy sat in the middle of the living room, his tail wagging excitedly as he watched Lily and Jack untangle a string of Christmas lights. Every so often he would tilt his head to the side, as if trying to understand what they were doing. Jack giggled as Buddy tried to grab one of the lights with his mouth, and Lily gently scolded him. "Buddy, no! These aren't for chewing!" Buddy let out a playful bark, his tail thumping against the floor, clearly enjoying the attention. The centerpiece of the living room was the Christmas tree, a tall, majestic pine that the family had picked out together from the local tree farm. It stood proudly in the corner, its branches waiting to be adorned with ornaments and lights. Mr. Johnson was busy setting up the tree stand, making sure it was sturdy and straight. "This year's tree is perfect," he said with a satisfied smile, stepping back to admire his work. "What do you think, Buddy?" he asked, turning to the dog. Buddy barked in agreement as if to say, "It's the best tree yet." Once the tree was secure, the family began decorating it together. Lily carefully hung delicate glass ornaments, while Jack enthusiastically tossed tinsel onto the branches. Mrs. Johnson added a string of popcorn garland that she and the kids had made earlier that week, and Mr. Johnson climbed a stepladder to place the star on top. Buddy watched the entire process with great interest, occasionally sniffing at the ornaments and wagging his tail whenever someone looked his way. The house was slowly transforming into a winter wonderland. The mantel above the fireplace was decorated with garlands of holly and pine cones, and stockings with each family member's name were hung with care. The windows were adorned with snowflake decals, and a wreath made of fresh pine hung on the front door. Outside, the Johnsons had strung colorful lights along the roof line, which glowed warmly against the snowy backdrop. For Buddy, this was the most exciting time of the year. He loved the hustle and bustle of Christmas preparations, the laughter and joy that filled the house, and most of all, the extra treats he always seemed to get during the holiday season. Lily had even made him his own stocking, which hung next to the others on the mantel. It was red with white trim, and his name was written on it in glittery gold letters. Buddy didn't know what was inside, but he could already smell something delicious. As the day went on, the family took a break from decorating to enjoy some hot cocoa and cookies by the fire. Buddy lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in contentment. The warmth of the fire and the sound of his family's laughter made him feel completely at peace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a soft, quiet blanket of white. That evening, as the Johnsons finished decorating the tree, they turned off all the lights in the house and plugged in the Christmas tree lights for the first time. The room was instantly bathed in a warm, golden glow, and everyone let out a collective "wow!" Even Buddy seemed mesmerized by the twinkling lights, his eyes reflecting the soft glow. Lily and Jack clapped their hands in delight, and Mrs. Johnson said, "It's beautiful. This is going to be the best Christmas yet. Buddy couldn't agree more. As he lay on his favorite rug, watching his family admire the tree, he felt a deep sense of happiness. He didn't understand the concept of Christmas, but he knew it was a time when his family was together, laughing, loving, and sharing special moments. And for Buddy, that was all that mattered. As the night grew darker and the snow outside piled higher, the Johnsons settled in for the evening. Lily and Jack went to bed, dreaming of the presents they would find under the tree on Christmas morning. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson sat by the fire, sipping tea and talking softly. Buddy curled up in his bed near the fireplace, his golden fur glowing in the firelight. He let out a contented sigh, his tail wagging slightly in his sleep. The first day of December had come to an end, and the magic of Christmas was just beginning. For Buddy, it was the start of another wonderful holiday season with the family he loved more than anything in the world. Little did he know, this Christmas would be unlike any other, a Christmas filled with challenges, bravery, and the kind of love that could overcome anything. But for now, Buddy was happy, surrounded by warmth, love, and the promise of a magical holiday ahead. The Johnson household was alive with excitement as the preparations for Christmas kicked into full swing. Snow continued to fall gently outside, blanketing the yard in a thick, fluffy layer of white. But inside, the house was warm and bustling with activity. The scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and freshly baked cookies filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of pine from the Christmas tree that stood proudly in the corner of the living room. It was the perfect setting for the holiday season, and everyone in the family, including Buddy, was ready to make this Christmas unforgettable. Buddy, the golden Labrador, was the first to sense the excitement in the air. His tail wagged furiously as he followed Lily and Jack around the house, his paws clicking softly on the wooden floor. He didn't fully understand what all the fuss was about, but he knew it was something special. The boxes of decorations, the laughter of the children, and the delicious smells coming from the kitchen all told him that something magical was happening. "All right, everyone," Mrs. Johnson called out from the kitchen, her voice cheerful and full of energy. "It's time to start decorating the tree." Lily and Jack let out excited cheers and ran to the living room, with Buddy trotting close behind them. The Christmas tree, a tall and majestic pine, stood in the corner of the room, its branches reaching out as if inviting the family to adorn it with festive decorations. The tree had been carefully chosen by the family a few days earlier during their annual trip to the local tree farm. It was Buddy's first time at the farm, and he had loved every moment of it, sniffing at the trees and bounding through the snow as the family picked out the perfect one. Now the tree stood bare, waiting to be transformed into a sparkling centerpiece of holiday cheer. Mr. Johnson brought in a large box filled with ornaments, lights, and tinsel, setting it down in the middle of the room. "Let's get started," he said with a grin, rolling up his sleeves. Lily carefully opened the box and pulled out a string of twinkling lights. "I'll do the lights," she announced, her face glowing with excitement. Jack, on the other hand, dove into the box and emerged with a handful of shiny ornaments. "I'll hang these," he said, holding them up for everyone to see. Buddy, of course, couldn't resist joining in. He sniffed at the box of decorations, his nose twitching as he investigated the shiny objects. "Buddy, no!" Lily laughed as Buddy tried to grab a strand of tinsel with his mouth. "That's not for you to chew on." Buddy let out a playful bark, his tail wagging so hard it thumped against the side of the couch. As the family worked together to decorate the tree, the room filled with laughter and the sound of Christmas music playing softly in the background. Lily carefully draped the lights around the tree, making sure they were evenly spaced, while Jack enthusiastically hung ornaments on the lower branches. Some of the ornaments were new, but many were old and held special memories. There was the snowman ornament that Lily had made in kindergarten, the glittery star that Jack had crafted last year, and the delicate glass angel that had been passed down from Mrs. Johnson's grandmother. "Don't forget the popcorn garland," Mrs. Johnson called from the kitchen, where she was busy preparing treats for the upcoming Christmas party. She had spent the morning baking cookies, pies, and other festive goodies, and now the counters were covered with trays of gingerbread men, sugar cookies, and chocolate fudge. The smell was irresistible, and Buddy's nose twitched as he caught a whiff of the delicious aromas. He wandered into the kitchen, his eyes wide and hopeful as he looked up at Mrs. Johnson. "Oh, Buddy," she said with a laugh, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You'll get your treat soon, don't worry." She handed him a small dog biscuit shaped like a bone, and Buddy happily trotted back to the living room, crunching on his snack. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson was busy untangling a particularly stubborn string of lights. "Why do these always get so tangled?" he muttered, holding up the knotted mess. Jack giggled and said, "Maybe Buddy did it." Buddy, hearing his name, looked up and wagged his tail, completely unaware of the accusation. Once the lights were finally untangled and strung around the tree, it was time for the finishing touches. Mrs. Johnson brought out the popcorn garland, which she and the kids had made earlier in the week. Lily and Jack carefully draped it around the tree, adding a touch of homemade charm. Finally, Mr. Johnson climbed a stepladder to place the star on top. "There we go," he said, stepping back to admire their work. "What do you think, Buddy?" Buddy barked in approval, his tail wagging furiously as he looked up at the tree. The lights twinkled like stars, and the ornaments sparkled in the warm glow. It was a sight to behold, and the family couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and joy as they admired their handiwork. With the tree decorated, the family turned their attention to the rest of the house. The mantel above the fireplace was adorned with garlands of holly and pine cones, and stockings with each family member's name were hung with care. Buddy even had his own stocking, a red one with white trim, and his name written in glittery gold letters. Jack insisted on hanging it himself, making sure it was placed right in the middle. Outside, Mr. Johnson and Jack braved the cold to string colorful lights along the roofline, while Lily and Mrs. Johnson worked on setting up a display of glowing reindeer and a sleigh in the front yard. Buddy watched from the window, his nose pressed against the glass as he wagged his tail. He wanted to be outside with them, but the warmth of the house and the cozy rug by the fireplace were too inviting to leave. By the time the sun began to set, the house was fully transformed into a winter wonderland. The tree glowed softly in the living room, the lights outside twinkled against the snowy backdrop, and the smell of freshly baked treats lingered in the air. The Johnsons were tired but happy, and Buddy was no exception. He lay on his favorite rug, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed as he listened to the sound of his family's laughter. "Tomorrow we'll start getting ready for the party," Mrs. Johnson said, sitting down on the couch with a cup of hot cocoa. "But for now, let's just enjoy this moment." The family gathered in the living room, sipping cocoa and admiring the tree. Buddy lay at their feet, his tail wagging lazily as he soaked in the warmth and love that filled the room. He didn't understand the concept of Christmas parties or decorations, but he knew one thing for certain: he was surrounded by the people he loved most in the world, and that was all that mattered. As the first day of Christmas preparations came to an end, Buddy let out a contented sigh and drifted off to sleep, dreaming of treats, snow, and the joy of being with his family. Little did he know this Christmas would bring challenges and adventures that would test his courage and loyalty like never before. But for now, all was calm, all was bright, and the magic of the season was just beginning. The snow outside fell steadily, blanketing the world in a soft, shimmering white. The streets were quiet, muffled by the thick layer of snow, and the only sounds were the occasional jingling of bells from a passing sleigh or the distant laughter of children playing in the snow. Inside the Johnson household, however, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. It was warm, lively, and filled with the unmistakable magic of Christmas Eve. The living room glowed with the soft, golden light of the Christmas tree, which stood proudly in the corner, adorned with twinkling lights, shiny ornaments, and a star that seemed to sparkle brighter than ever. The fireplace crackled and popped, casting a warm glow across the room and filling the air with the comforting scent of burning wood. Stockings hung neatly on the mantel, each one embroidered with a name: Lily, Jack, Mom, Dad, and of course, Buddy. The red stocking with Buddy's name in glittery gold letters hung right in the middle, a testament to his place as a beloved member of the family. Buddy, the golden Labrador, lay sprawled out on the rug in front of the fireplace, his golden fur glowing in the firelight. His tail wagged lazily as he watched his family bustle around the room, their faces lit with joy and excitement. He didn't fully understand what Christmas was, but he could feel the love and happiness in the air, and that was enough for him. "All right, everyone, it's time to get started," Mrs. Johnson announced, clapping her hands together. She was wearing a festive red sweater with a snowflake pattern, and her cheeks were rosy from the warmth of the fire. "Let's gather around the tree." Lily and Jack came running into the room, their faces glowing with excitement. Lily, wearing her favorite Christmas pajamas covered in tiny reindeer, carried a plate of freshly baked cookies, while Jack, in his snowman pajamas, held a steaming mug of hot cocoa topped with marshmallows. Mr. Johnson followed behind them, carrying a tray with more mugs of cocoa for everyone. He set the tray down on the coffee table and took a seat on the couch, patting the spot next to him for Mrs. Johnson to join him. Buddy perked up at the sight of the cookies, his nose twitching as he caught the sweet, buttery scent. He sat up and tilted his head, his big brown eyes fixed on the plate in Lily's hands. "Don't worry, Buddy," Lily said with a giggle. "We didn't forget about you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a special dog treat shaped like a Christmas tree. Buddy's tail wagged furiously as she handed it to him, and he happily trotted back to his spot by the fire to enjoy his treat. With everyone gathered around the tree, the family began their Christmas Eve tradition of singing carols. Mrs. Johnson started with Silent Night, her voice soft and melodic, and soon the rest of the family joined in. Lily's sweet soprano blended with Jack's enthusiastic, if slightly off-key, singing, while Mr. Johnson's deep baritone provided a steady foundation. Even Buddy seemed to join in, letting out a happy bark at the end of each song. The carols filled the room with warmth and joy, and for a moment it felt as though the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only the Johnsons and the magic of Christmas. After a few more songs, including a lively rendition of Jingle Bells that had Jack shaking a pair of sleigh bells he'd found in the decoration box, the family settled back onto the couch and chairs, ready for the next part of their Christmas Eve tradition. "Now it's time for presents," Jack exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. He ran to the tree and began sorting through the brightly wrapped packages, reading the tags to find out who each one was for. "This one's for Lily, this one's for Mom, and this one's for Buddy," he said, holding up a small package wrapped in red paper with a green bow. Buddy's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and he got up from his spot by the fire, trotting over to Jack. Jack handed him the package, and Buddy sniffed it curiously, his tail wagging. "Go on, Buddy, open it," Lily encouraged, laughing as Buddy pawed at the paper. With a little help from Jack, Buddy managed to tear off the wrapping, revealing a brand new chew toy shaped like a candy cane. He barked happily and immediately began chewing on it, his tail wagging so hard it thumped against the floor. The rest of the family began opening their presents, the room filling with the sound of tearing paper, exclamations of delight and laughter. Lily unwrapped a set of watercolor paints and a sketchbook, her eyes lighting up as she hugged her parents in thanks. Jack opened a box to find a remote-controlled car, which he immediately began driving around the room, much to Buddy's amusement. Mrs. Johnson received a cozy knit scarf in her favorite shade of blue, and Mr. Johnson unwrapped a new set of tools for his workshop. As the pile of presents under the tree grew smaller, the family took a moment to admire their gifts and thank each other. Buddy, now lying on the rug with his new chew toy, looked up at his family with a contented expression. He didn't need presents to feel happy. Being surrounded by the people he loved was the greatest gift of all. After the presents were opened, the family gathered around the fireplace to enjoy their hot cocoa and cookies. The room was quiet now, except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of Buddy gnawing on his toy. Lily and Jack leaned against their parents, their eyes growing heavy as the excitement of the evening began to catch up with them. "This has been the best Christmas Eve ever," Lily said softly, her voice filled with contentment. Jack nodded in agreement, his head resting on his father's shoulder. "Yeah, it's perfect," he murmured, his eyes closing. Mrs. Johnson smiled and kissed the top of Lily's head. "It's not over yet," she said. "Tomorrow is Christmas Day, and there's still so much to look forward to." Buddy, sensing the peacefulness of the moment, got up from his spot and walked over to the couch, resting his head on Mrs. Johnson's lap. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, and he let out a happy sigh, his tail wagging gently. As the fire burned low and the snow continued to fall outside, the Johnson family sat together, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the magic of Christmas. Buddy closed his eyes, his heart full of happiness. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. As long as he was with his family, every day would feel like Christmas. And so, as the clock struck midnight and Christmas Day officially began, the Johnsons and Buddy drifted off to sleep, their hearts full of joy and their home filled with the spirit of the season. The day after Christmas Eve began peacefully. The Johnson family woke up to a world blanketed in white, the snow from the previous night having settled thickly over the town. The morning was calm, with the sun peeking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the snowy landscape. Buddy, the golden Labrador, bounded outside with Jack and Lily, his paws sinking into the fresh snow as he barked joyfully. The children laughed as they threw snowballs at each other, and Buddy darted between them, trying to catch the flying snow in his mouth. It was a perfect winter morning, filled with the lingering magic of Christmas. By the afternoon, however, the weather began to change. The once clear sky turned a dull gray, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows of the Johnson house. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew heavy with the promise of more snow. Mrs. Johnson, who had been watching the weather forecast on TV, furrowed her brow as the meteorologist issued a warning. A severe snowstorm was heading their way, expected to hit the town by evening. "Looks like we're in for a big one," she said, turning to Mr. Johnson, who was busy stacking firewood by the fireplace. "They're saying it could be the worst storm we've had in years." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression serious. "We'd better get ready just in case. I'll make sure the generator is working and we'll stock up on supplies." He glanced out the window, where the wind was already whipping the snow into swirling drifts. "It's going to get rough out there." The cheerful atmosphere of the morning began to shift as the family prepared for the storm. Lily and Jack helped their parents gather blankets, flashlights, and extra food, while Buddy followed them around the house, sensing the change in mood. His tail, which usually wagged constantly, was still, and his ears perked up as he listened to the wind howling outside. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel the tension in the air. By the time evening arrived, the storm had fully descended upon the town. The wind roared like a freight train, shaking the house and causing the lights to flicker. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, piling up against the windows and burying the front yard. The once cozy living room, where the family had gathered the night before to sing carols and open presents, now felt small and vulnerable against the fury of the storm outside. The Johnsons huddled together in the living room, the fireplace blazing to keep the cold at bay. Mrs. Johnson had made hot cocoa for everyone, but the usual warmth and comfort it brought were overshadowed by the howling wind and the creaking of the house. Jack clutched his mug tightly, his eyes wide as he listened to the storm. "Is it going to break the house?" he asked, his voice trembling. "No, sweetheart," Mr. Johnson said, putting a reassuring arm around his son. "This house is strong. It's been through storms before, and it'll get through this one too." He glanced at Mrs. Johnson, who gave him a small, worried smile. They both knew this storm was different, stronger, more dangerous, but they didn't want to frighten the children. Buddy, lying on the rug near the fireplace, watched his family closely. He could sense their unease, and it made him restless. He got up and padded over to Lily, nudging her hand with his nose. She smiled weakly and scratched behind his ears. "It's okay, Buddy," she said softly, though her voice wavered. "We're safe here." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, making everyone jump. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jack let out a small cry, and Lily grabbed Buddy's collar, holding on tightly. "What was that?" she whispered. Mr. Johnson grabbed a flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "It sounded like something hit the house," he said, his voice calm but tense. "Stay here. I'll go check it out." "I'm coming with you," Mrs. Johnson said, grabbing another flashlight. The two of them headed toward the front door, leaving Lily, Jack, and Buddy in the living room. The children sat close together, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. Buddy stood alert, his ears pricked and his body tense, ready to protect his family if needed. When Mr. and Mrs. Johnson returned, their faces were grim. "A tree fell," Mr. Johnson said, setting down the flashlight. "It's blocking the front door, and it took down the power lines. That's why the lights went out." "Are we stuck here?" Jack asked, his voice small. "For now, yes," Mrs. Johnson said gently. "But we have everything we need. The fireplace will keep us warm, and we have plenty of food and water. We'll be okay." Despite her reassuring words, the tension in the room was palpable. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the wind continued to howl, shaking the windows and making the house creak. The family tried to stay calm, but the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on them. Buddy, sensing the unease, became more alert. He paced around the room, occasionally stopping to sniff at the door or look out the window, though the snow was so thick that he couldn't see anything. His instincts told him that something was wrong, and he wanted to do something to help, but he didn't know what. As the hours passed, the storm raged on, and the family did their best to keep their spirits up. They played board games by flashlight, told stories, and tried to focus on the warmth of the fire rather than the chaos outside. But as the night wore on, the reality of their situation became harder to ignore. The snow was piling up higher and higher, and the wind showed no signs of dying down. At one point, Buddy stood by the window, his nose pressed against the glass. He let out a low, uneasy growl, catching the attention of Mr. Johnson. "What is it, boy?" he asked, walking over to the dog. Buddy didn't move, his eyes fixed on the swirling snow outside. Mr. Johnson peered out the window but saw nothing but white. Still, Buddy's behavior made him uneasy. "He knows something's up," he said quietly to Mrs. Johnson. As midnight approached, the family began to feel the weight of exhaustion. Jack had fallen asleep on the couch, his head resting on Lily's shoulder, while Mrs. Johnson dozed in an armchair. Mr. Johnson sat by the fire, keeping an eye on the flames to make sure they didn't go out. Buddy lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every sound. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, a fragile sense of calm had settled over the family. They didn't know what the morning would bring, but they knew they had each other, and Buddy, to see them through. And as the fire crackled and the wind howled, Buddy kept watch, ready to protect his family from whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm raged on through the night, its howling winds battering the Johnson house with relentless force. Snow piled higher and higher against the windows, and the once cozy home now felt like a fragile shelter in the face of nature's fury. Inside, the family huddled together in the living room, the fireplace their only source of light and warmth after the power had gone out. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, and the occasional creak of the house under the pressure of the wind made everyone jump. Buddy, the golden Labrador, lay near the fireplace, his ears twitching at every sound. He was restless, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. He would occasionally get up, pacing the room and sniffing at the door, his tail low and his body tense. The family noticed his unease, and it only added to their growing anxiety. "What time is it?" Lily asked, her voice small and uncertain. She was curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her, her brother Jack sitting close beside her. Mr. Johnson glanced at his watch, the faint glow of its face barely visible in the dim light. "It's almost midnight," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a tension in his tone that he couldn't hide. He looked toward the window, where the snow was still falling heavily, the wind whipping it into swirling drifts. "The storm doesn't seem to be letting up." Mrs. Johnson, sitting in an armchair with a flashlight in her lap, tried to reassure the children. "We're safe here," she said, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "The house is strong and we have everything we need. We just have to wait it out." But even as she spoke, a loud, ominous creak echoed through the house, followed by a deep, resonating crash that shook the walls. The sound was so sudden and so loud that everyone froze, their eyes wide with fear. Buddy leapt to his feet, barking furiously, his body rigid as he stared toward the front of the house. "What was that?" Jack whispered, clutching Lily's arm. Mr. Johnson was already on his feet, grabbing the flashlight from the coffee table. "Stay here," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I'll go check it out." "I'm coming with you," Mrs. Johnson said, standing up and grabbing her own flashlight. She gave the children a reassuring look. "Stay with Buddy. We'll be right back." As the parents disappeared down the hallway, the children sat in silence, their hearts pounding. Buddy stood near the door, his ears perked and his body tense, ready to spring into action if needed. The sound of the wind outside seemed louder now, and the house creaked and groaned under its force. In the front hallway, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson made their way to the door, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. When they reached the front window, they stopped, their breath catching in their throats. Outside, illuminated by the faint glow of the snow, they could see the massive silhouette of a tree lying across the front yard. Its branches sprawled in every direction, and its trunk was pressed against the front of the house, blocking the door completely. "Oh no," Mrs. Johnson whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's the old oak tree." Mr. Johnson nodded grimly. The oak tree had stood in their yard for decades, its thick trunk and sprawling branches a familiar sight. But now, it was nothing more than a fallen giant, brought down by the relentless wind. "It must have been the wind," he said, his voice low. "The ground so frozen the roots couldn't hold." He shone his flashlight along the length of the tree, his stomach sinking as he saw the damage. The branches had smashed into the front of the house, cracking the siding and shattering one of the small windows near the door. Worse still, The tree had taken down the power lines as it fell, leaving them completely cut off. "We're trapped," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice trembling. "The door's blocked, and the snow's too deep to get out the back." Mr. Johnson put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said, though he wasn't sure how. "Let's go back to the kids. We don't want them to worry." When they returned to the living room, Lily and Jack looked up at them expectantly. "What happened?" Lily asked, her voice shaky. "A tree fell," Mrs. Johnson said gently, sitting down beside them. "It's blocking the front door and it took down the power lines. But we're okay. The house is still safe." Jack's eyes widened. "Does that mean we can't get out?" "For now, yes," Mr. Johnson admitted, sitting down across from them. "But we'll figure something out. The storm will pass, and we'll clear the tree when it's safe." The children nodded, though they still looked worried. Buddy, sensing their fear, walked over to them and nuzzled Lily's hand, his tail wagging slightly. She smiled weakly and scratched behind his ears. "At least we have Buddy," she said softly. "He'll keep us safe." The family tried to settle back into their routine, but the tension in the room was palpable. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling and the snow piling higher and higher. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, its warmth a small comfort against the chaos outside. As the hours passed, the family grew more anxious. The realization that they were trapped with no way to call for help and no way to leave the house weighed heavily on them. Mr. Johnson tried to keep everyone calm, suggesting they play a board game or tell stories, but it was clear that the situation was taking its toll. Buddy, however, refused to rest. He paced the room, his ears twitching at every sound, his nose sniffing the air as if searching for a solution. He could sense the fear in his family, and it made him restless. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. At one point, he walked over to the window and pressed his nose against the glass, staring out at the swirling snow. He let out a low, uneasy growl, catching Mr. Johnson's attention. "What is it, boy?" he asked, walking over to the dog. Buddy didn't move, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Mr. Johnson sighed and patted Buddy's head. "I know, boy," he said quietly. "We'll get through this." As the night wore on, the family began to feel the weight of exhaustion. Jack and Lily eventually fell asleep on the couch, their heads resting against each other, while Mrs. Johnson dozed in the armchair. Mr. Johnson sat by the fire, keeping an eye on the flames to make sure they didn't go out. Buddy lay at his feet, his body still tense, his ears alert for any sign of danger. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, a fragile sense of calm had settled over the family. They didn't know what the morning would bring, but they knew they had each other and Buddy to see them through. And as the fire crackled and the wind howled, Buddy kept watch, ready to protect his family from whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm had not let up. The wind howled like a wild beast, shaking the house and rattling the windows. Snow continued to fall in thick, blinding sheets, piling higher and higher against the walls of the Johnson home. Inside, the family was huddled together in the living room, their faces lit only by the flickering glow of the fireplace. The air was heavy with worry. The fallen tree had blocked the front door, the power was out, and the family was completely cut off from the outside world. Buddy, the golden Labrador, lay near the fire, his ears twitching at every sound. He could sense the tension in the room, the fear in his family's voices, and the unease in their movements. He had always been attuned to their emotions, and now more than ever, he felt the weight of their distress. His instincts told him that something needed to be done. They couldn't stay like this forever. The storm was fierce, but Buddy knew he had to act. It started with a low growl deep in his throat. He stood up, his tail stiff, and walked to the window. His nose pressed against the cold glass, and he stared out into the swirling snow. The world outside was a blur of white, the wind whipping the snow into chaotic spirals. But Buddy didn't flinch. He let out a sharp bark, drawing the attention of Mr. Johnson. "What is it, boy?" Mr. Johnson asked, walking over to him. Buddy barked again, more urgently this time, and pawed at the window. His message was clear. He wanted to go outside. Mrs. Johnson frowned. "He can't go out there. It's too dangerous," she said, her voice filled with concern. "The storm is still too strong." But Buddy barked again, his eyes fixed on Mr. Johnson. There was a determination in his gaze, a silent plea that his family couldn't ignore. He wasn't just asking to go outside, he was telling them he needed to. He needed to help. Mr. Johnson knelt down and placed a hand on Buddy's head. "You want to go for help, don't you?" he said softly. Buddy wagged his tail slightly, his eyes never leaving Mr. Johnson's. "You think you can make it?" Mrs. Johnson looked at her husband in alarm. "You're not seriously thinking of letting him go, are you? He's just a dog. What if he gets lost? What if he doesn't come back?" "He's not just a dog," Mr. Johnson said firmly. "He's Buddy, and if anyone can do this, it's him." The family gathered around Buddy, their faces a mix of hope and fear. Lily knelt down and hugged him tightly, her tears soaking into his golden fur. "Be careful, Buddy," she whispered. "Please come back." Jack placed a small flashlight around Buddy's neck, securing it with a strap. "So you can see in the dark," he said, his voice trembling. "And so people can see you." Mrs. Johnson wrapped a scarf around Buddy's neck, tucking it securely under his collar. "To keep you warm," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, Buddy, be safe." Mr. Johnson opened the back door, the only exit not blocked by the fallen tree. A blast of icy wind and snow rushed into the house, making everyone shiver. Buddy stood at the threshold, his body tense but ready. He turned back to look at his family one last time, his eyes filled with determination. Then, with a final bark, he leapt into the storm. The cold hit Buddy like a wall, the wind biting into his fur and the snow stinging his face. But he didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, his paws sinking into the deep snow with every step. The world around him was a blur of white, the wind howling so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. But Buddy didn't stop. He had a mission, and he wasn't going to fail. The snow was deep, almost up to his chest in some places, but Buddy powered through it, his strong legs propelling him forward. His breath came out in visible puffs, and his fur was quickly coated in frost. The flashlight around his neck bobbed with each step, casting a faint beam of light that barely cut through the swirling snow. But Buddy didn't need the light. His keen senses guided him, his nose picking up faint scents and his ears straining to hear anything beyond the wind. He knew the way to the nearest neighbor's house. It was about half a mile down the road, a distance that would normally take only a few minutes to cover. But in this storm, it felt like an endless journey. The snow was relentless, and the wind seemed determined to push him back. But Buddy pressed on, his determination unwavering. As he trudged through the snow, Buddy's mind was focused on his family. He thought of Lily's tearful hug, Jack's trembling hands as he secured the flashlight, and Mrs. Johnson's worried eyes as she wrapped the scarf around his neck. He thought of Mr. Johnson's firm words, "If anyone can do this, it's him." Buddy wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for them. They were counting on him, and he wouldn't let them down. The road was barely visible under the thick layer of snow, but Buddy stayed on course. He recognized the faint outlines of trees and fences, his sharp memory guiding him even when the storm tried to confuse him. At one point, a gust of wind nearly knocked him off his feet, but he dug his claws into the snow and held his ground. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. As he moved forward, Buddy's body began to ache from the cold and the effort of pushing through the snow. His paws were numb, and his fur was heavy with ice. But he didn't let it slow him down. He kept his head low, shielding his face from the wind, and focused on putting one paw in front of the other. Step by step, he moved closer to his goal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Buddy saw a faint light in the distance. It was the neighbor's house, its windows glowing warmly against the cold, dark night. Buddy's heart leapt with relief, and he quickened his pace, his tired legs finding new strength. He reached the front porch and barked loudly, his voice cutting through the storm. Inside, the neighbor, Mr. Carter, heard the barking and rushed to the door. He opened it to find Buddy standing there, covered in snow and shivering, but still standing tall. The flashlight around his neck flickered weakly, and the scarf was frozen stiff, but Buddy's eyes were bright with determination. "Buddy," Mr. Carter said in surprise, "what are you doing out here, boy?" Buddy barked again, his message clear. He needed help. Realizing the urgency, Mr. Carter quickly grabbed his coat and boots. "Let's go," he said, patting Buddy's head. "Lead the way." Buddy turned and began the journey back, his heart filled with hope. He had done it. He had found help. And now, with Mr. Carter following close behind, he was on his way back to his family. The storm was still raging, but Buddy didn't feel the cold anymore. All he could think about was getting home and seeing the relieved faces of the people he loved most in the world. Buddy had faced the storm and won. He was their hero, and he was bringing help. The storm continued to rage, its icy winds howling through the night and snow falling in relentless waves. The world outside was a frozen, chaotic blur, but Buddy, the golden Labrador, had made it through. His determination and love for his family had carried him through the blizzard to the neighbor's house, where he now stood on the porch, barking loudly to get their attention. Inside the warm, cozy home of the Carters, the sound of Buddy's barking cut through the muffled roar of the storm. Mr. Carter, a tall man with a kind face, was sitting by the fireplace with his wife and teenage son, sipping hot cocoa and listening to the wind batter the windows. At first, he thought the sound was just the storm playing tricks on his ears, but when the barking grew louder and more insistent, he stood up, his brow furrowed. "Do you hear that?" he asked, setting his mug down on the coffee table. Mrs. Carter looked up from her knitting, her expression puzzled. "It sounds like a dog," she said. "But who would let their dog out in this weather?" Their son Ethan got up and walked to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. "I can't see anything," he said, squinting, "but it's definitely a dog. It sounds close." Mr. Carter grabbed a flashlight from the shelf near the door and pulled on his heavy winter coat. "Stay here," he said to his family. "I'll go check it out." He opened the door, and a blast of icy wind and snow rushed into the house, making him shiver. He stepped onto the porch, shining the flashlight into the storm. At first, he saw nothing but white, the snow swirling so thickly that it was hard to make out anything beyond a few feet. But then, the beam of light caught a shape, a golden dog standing in the snow, barking and wagging its tail. "Buddy?" Mr. Carter said in surprise, recognizing the Johnsons' dog. "What are you doing out here, boy?" Buddy barked again, his tail wagging furiously as he stepped closer to Mr. Carter. His fur was coated in snow, and the scarf around his neck was frozen stiff, but his eyes were bright and full of urgency. He pawed at Mr. Carter's leg, then turned and looked back toward the road, as if trying to tell him something. "Something's wrong," Mr. Carter muttered to himself. He crouched down and patted Buddy's head. "What is it, boy? Are the Johnsons okay?" Buddy barked again, then took a few steps toward the road, looking back at Mr. Carter as if to say, "Follow me." By now, Mrs. Carter and Ethan had come to the door, curious about the commotion. "It's Buddy," Mr. Carter called to them. "I think he's trying to tell us something." Mrs. Carter's face filled with concern. "The Johnsons must be in trouble," she said. "Why else would Buddy be out in this storm?" Ethan grabbed his coat and boots. "We have to help them," he said. "Buddy wouldn't come all this way if it wasn't important." Mr. Carter nodded. "You're right. Let's get some supplies and follow him." The Carters quickly gathered what they needed: flashlights, blankets, a first aid kit, and a thermos of hot cocoa. Mr. Carter also grabbed a sturdy rope, just in case they needed it to navigate through the deep snow. Once they were ready, they stepped out into the storm, following Buddy as he led the way. Buddy moved with purpose, his paws sinking into the snow with every step. The journey back to the Johnsons' house was just as treacherous as the journey to the Carters had been, but Buddy didn't slow down. He knew his family was waiting for him, and now that he had help, he was determined to get back to them as quickly as possible. The Carters followed close behind, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The wind was fierce, whipping snow into their faces and making it hard to see, but they trusted Buddy to guide them. Every so often, Buddy would stop and look back to make sure they were still with him, his tail wagging slightly as if to encourage them to keep going. "This dog is incredible," Ethan said, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "He's like a real-life hero." "He is," Mr. Carter agreed, his voice filled with admiration. "The Johnsons are lucky to have him." The journey was slow and difficult. The snow was deep, and the wind made it hard to keep their footing. At one point, Mrs. Carter stumbled and nearly fell, but Buddy was there in an instant, standing by her side and nudging her gently until she regained her balance. "Thank you, Buddy," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You're amazing." Buddy barked softly in response, then continued leading the way. Back at the Johnson house, the family was growing more anxious by the minute. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the fallen tree blocking the front door made them feel trapped and isolated. The fire in the fireplace was still burning, but the room was growing colder as the night wore on. Lily sat on the couch, clutching Buddy's favorite chew toy in her hands. "Do you think he's okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's more than okay," Mr. Johnson said, though his voice was tight with worry. "Buddy's smart. He'll find help." Mrs. Johnson tried to smile, but her eyes were filled with tears. "I just hope he's safe," she said. "This storm is so dangerous." Suddenly, Jack, who had been sitting by the window, let out a shout. "I see something," he said, pointing outside. "There's a light." The family rushed to the window. their breath fogging up the glass as they peered out into the storm. At first, they saw nothing but swirling snow, but then, faintly, they saw it, a beam of light moving toward the house. And then, through the snow, they saw him, Buddy leading the way, with the Carters following close behind. "They're here," Lily cried, tears streaming down her face. "Buddy did it. He found help." The family rushed to the back door, throwing it open just as Buddy bounded inside, shaking the snow from his fur and barking excitedly. Lily and Jack threw their arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. "You're amazing, Buddy," Lily said, burying her face in his fur. "You're our hero." The Carters followed Buddy inside, their faces red from the cold but filled with relief. "We came as fast as we could," Mr. Carter said, setting down the supplies they had brought. "Buddy showed up at our house and wouldn't stop barking until we followed him. What happened?" Mr. Johnson quickly explained about the fallen tree and the power outage, and the Carters nodded in understanding. "We'll help you clear the tree as soon as the storm lets up," Mr. Carter said. "For now, let's make sure everyone stays warm and safe." The two families worked together to make the best of the situation. The Carters shared their blankets and hot cocoa, and the Johnsons were filled with gratitude for their kindness. Buddy, exhausted but happy, lay by the fire, his tail wagging as he watched his family and their neighbors come together. That night, as the storm continued to rage outside, the Johnsons knew they were no longer alone. Thanks to Buddy's bravery and determination, help had arrived, and they were safe. Buddy had proven once again that he was more than just a dog. He was a true hero. The storm had finally begun to subside. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the heavy clouds, the howling winds had quieted to a low whistle, and the relentless snowfall had slowed to a gentle flurry. The world outside the Johnson house was unrecognizable, a vast white expanse of snow-covered ground, with drifts piled high against the walls and windows. The fallen oak tree still lay sprawled across the front yard, its massive branches blocking the door and trapping the family inside. But now, thanks to Buddy's heroic journey, help had arrived. Inside the house, the Johnsons and the Carters were gathered around the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and discussing their plan of action. Buddy lay curled up on the rug, his body finally relaxed after his exhausting journey through the storm. His tail wagged lazily as he listened to the voices of his family and their neighbors, his heart content knowing that he had done his part. "We need to clear that tree as soon as possible," Mr. Carter said, his voice firm but calm. "It's blocking the front door, and it's also taken down the power lines. We'll need to call the rescue services to report the damage and make sure the lines are repaired." Mr. Johnson nodded. "Agreed, but that tree is massive. It's going to take all of us working together to move it." Ethan, Mr. Carter's teenage son, leaned forward eagerly. "I'll help," he said. "I'm strong enough to handle the branches." Jack, sitting beside him, piped up, "Me too. I want to help." Mrs. Johnson smiled at her son, though her expression was still tinged with worry. "It's dangerous out there," she said. "The snow is deep, and the branches could be unstable." "We'll be careful," Mr. Carter reassured her. "We'll take it one step at a time. The important thing is that we work together." Mrs. Carter placed a comforting hand on Mrs. Johnson's shoulder. "Don't worry," she said. "We've been through storms like this before. We'll get through it together." Bundled up in their warmest coats, gloves, and scarves, the two families stepped outside into the cold, crisp morning air. The snow crunched under their boots as they made their way to the front yard, where the fallen oak tree loomed like a giant, its branches sprawled across the ground in every direction. The sight of it was daunting, but no one hesitated. They were determined to tackle the challenge together. Mr. Carter took charge, organizing the group into teams. "Ethan and I will start cutting the smaller branches," he said, holding up a handsaw he had brought from his house. "Once we clear those, we can work on the larger limbs. Mr. Johnson, you and Jack can start shoveling the snow around the base of the tree so we can see what we're dealing with." "What about me?" Lily asked, her voice eager. "You can help your mom and Mrs. Carter gather the branches we cut and pile them to the side," Mr. Carter said with a smile. "Every little bit helps." Buddy, who had followed the group outside, barked enthusiastically, his tail wagging as if to say, "I'm ready to help too." The families got to work, their breath visible in the cold air as they tackled the massive tree. Mr. Carter and Ethan worked tirelessly with the handsaw, cutting away the smaller branches and tossing them to the side. Mr. Johnson and Jack shoveled snow with determination, clearing a path around the tree and exposing its thick trunk. Lily and the two mothers gathered the cut branches, dragging them to a pile near the edge of the yard. Even Buddy pitched in, grabbing smaller sticks in his mouth and carrying them to the pile, much to the delight of the children. The work was hard and slow, but no one complained. The families encouraged each other with smiles and words of support, their spirits lifted by the sense of teamwork and camaraderie. Every time someone's hands grew too cold or their muscles began to ache, they would take a short break, warming up with sips of hot cocoa from the thermos Mrs. Carter had brought. Then, they would dive back into the work, their determination renewed. As the hours passed, the tree began to shrink. The smaller branches were cleared away, leaving only the larger limbs and the massive trunk. Mr. Carter and Mr. Johnson worked together to cut through the thickest parts of the tree, their hands steady despite the cold. Ethan and Jack helped by dragging the heavy limbs away, their faces red from the effort but glowing with pride. "This is harder than I thought," Jack admitted, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "You're doing great," Ethan said, clapping him on the back. "We're almost there." Meanwhile, Lily and Buddy worked side by side, gathering the last of the smaller branches. "You're such a good boy, Buddy," Lily said, scratching behind his ears. "We couldn't have done this without you." Buddy barked happily, his tail wagging as he picked up another stick and carried it to the pile. By midday, the tree was finally cleared enough to allow access to the front door. The families stood back to admire their work, their faces flushed with cold but filled with satisfaction. The yard was still a mess of snow and branches, but the path was clear, and the house was no longer trapped. "We did it," Mr. Johnson said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, all of you. We couldn't have done this without your help." "That's what neighbors are for," Mr. Carter said with a smile. "Now let's get inside and call the rescue services. They'll need to know about the power lines." Back inside the house, the families gathered around the fireplace once more, warming their hands and sipping hot cocoa. Mr. Carter used his cell phone to call the local rescue services, explaining the situation and requesting assistance with the downed power lines. The operator assured him that a crew would be dispatched as soon as possible, though it might take some time due to the widespread damage caused by the storm. "We've done all we can for now," Mr. Carter said, setting the phone down. "The rescue team will take care of the rest." Mrs. Johnson smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said. "You didn't have to come out in this storm, but you did. It means the world to us." Mrs. Carter waved her hand dismissively. "Of course we came," she said. "When Buddy showed up at our door, we knew it was serious. We're just glad we could help." Ethan grinned. "Buddy's the real hero here," he said, reaching down to scratch the dog's head. "If it weren't for him, we wouldn't have known you needed help." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes bright with happiness. He didn't need words to understand the love and gratitude in the room. He had done what he set out to do. He had protected his family and brought them the help they needed. As the day wore on, the families shared stories and laughter, their bond strengthened by the challenges they had faced together. The storm had tested them, but it had also brought them closer, reminding them of the importance of community and the power of working together. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, covering the yard in a fresh blanket of white. But inside, the warmth of friendship and teamwork filled the house, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the unwavering loyalty of a dog named Buddy. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white snow. The once howling winds were now a distant memory, replaced by a calm, almost serene silence. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a soft golden glow over the landscape. The Johnsons' yard, which had been a chaotic mess of snow and fallen branches just hours ago, now looked peaceful, though the remnants of the storm's fury were still visible. The massive oak tree had been cleared, and the path to the front door was open once more. Inside the house, the warmth of the fireplace and the laughter of two families filled the air. The Carters had stayed for a while longer after the tree was cleared, sharing stories and enjoying the sense of accomplishment that came from working together. But now, with the worst of the crisis behind them, it was time for them to return to their own home. The Johnsons stood at the door, bundled up in coats and scarves, waving goodbye as their neighbors trudged through the snow toward their house. "Thank you again for everything," Mr. Johnson called out, his voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you." Mr. Carter turned and waved back, a warm smile on his face. "We're just glad everyone's safe," he said, "and give Buddy an extra treat from us. He's the real hero here." Ethan, walking beside his parents, gave Buddy a thumbs up. "You're the best, Buddy," he shouted. "Take care of your family." Buddy, standing proudly beside the Johnsons, barked in response, his tail wagging furiously. He watched as the Carters disappeared into the distance, their figures growing smaller against the snowy backdrop. When they were finally out of sight, Buddy turned and looked up at his family, his eyes shining with happiness. He didn't need words to understand the love and gratitude radiating from them. Back inside the house, the Johnsons gathered in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The room, which had felt so tense and uncertain during the storm, was now filled with a sense of peace and relief. The family sat together on the couch, their faces glowing with warmth and gratitude. "I still can't believe everything that happened," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice soft. She looked at Buddy, who was lying on the rug near the fire, his head resting on his paws. "And I can't believe how brave Buddy was. He saved us." "He really did," Mr. Johnson agreed, his tone filled with pride. "If he hadn't gone out into that storm to find help, we'd still be stuck here. And who knows how long it would have taken for someone to find us." Lily leaned down and hugged Buddy tightly, burying her face in his soft fur. "You're the best dog in the whole world," she said, her voice muffled. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Jack nodded, his eyes wide with admiration. "You're a hero, Buddy," he said. "You're like one of those dogs in the movies, the ones who save the day." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes closing as he enjoyed the affection from his family. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He had simply done what he felt was right. His family was everything to him, and he would do anything to protect them. As the day went on, the Johnsons took time to reflect on everything they had been through. The storm had been one of the worst they had ever experienced, and the challenges it brought had tested them in ways they hadn't expected. But it had also reminded them of the strength of their bond as a family, and of the incredible loyalty and courage of their beloved dog. Mrs. Johnson prepared a special meal to celebrate their safety and to thank Buddy for his bravery. She cooked his favorite dish, chicken and rice, and served it to him in a big bowl, placing it on the floor near the fireplace. "This is for you, Buddy," she said, smiling as she watched him wag his tail excitedly. "You've earned it." Buddy didn't need to be told twice. He dug into the meal with gusto, his tail wagging the entire time. The family watched him with smiles on their faces, their hearts full of love for the dog who had done so much for them. After dinner, the family decided to spend the evening together, enjoying the warmth and comfort of their home. They played board games, told stories, and laughed until their sides hurt. The tension and fear of the previous night seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude for the simple joys of being together. At one point, Lily brought out a piece of paper and some markers. "I want to make a certificate for Buddy," she announced. "He deserves an award for being the best dog ever." Jack immediately joined in, helping her design the certificate. They wrote "Hero of the Year" in big, colorful letters at the top and drew a picture of Buddy in the center. When they were finished, they presented it to him with great ceremony, holding it up for him to see. "Buddy, this is for you," Lily said, kneeling down and holding the certificate in front of him. "You're our hero." Buddy tilted his head, his ears perking up as he looked at the colorful paper. He didn't understand what it said, but he could feel the love and pride in their voices. He barked happily, his tail wagging as he licked Lily's face. As the evening wore on, the family began to wind down, the events of the past day catching up with them. The children yawned and stretched, their eyelids growing heavy, and even Buddy seemed ready to rest, his body stretched out on the rug near the fire. Before heading to bed, Mr. Johnson knelt down beside Buddy and scratched behind his ears. "You're an amazing dog, Buddy," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We're so lucky to have you in our lives." Mrs. Johnson joined him, placing a gentle hand on Buddy's back. "You're more than just a pet," she said. "You're family, and we're so proud of you." Buddy looked up at them, his eyes soft and full of love. He didn't need words to understand what they were saying. He could feel it in their touch, in their voices, in the way they looked at him. He was home, and he was loved. That night, as the Johnsons slept soundly in their warm beds, Buddy lay curled up on his favorite spot near the fireplace. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft crackling of the dying fire. Outside, the snow-covered world glowed faintly under the light of the moon, peaceful and still. Buddy's eyes closed, and he let out a contented sigh. He didn't think about the storm or the challenges he had faced. All that mattered to him was that his family was safe and happy. He had done his job, and now he could rest. In the days to come, the Johnsons would tell the story of Buddy's bravery to anyone who would listen. They would share how their loyal dog had faced the storm to find help, how he had brought their neighbors to their rescue, and how he had reminded them of the power of love and loyalty. But for now, they simply cherished the quiet moments, grateful for each other, and for the dog who had brought them safely through the storm. Buddy was more than a hero. He was their heart, their protector, and their greatest source of joy. And as he drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the warmth of his family, the snow outside sparkled under the soft glow of the moonlight, blanketing the world in a serene, magical stillness. The storm was now a distant memory, and the Johnson family's home was filled with warmth, laughter, and the unmistakable spirit of Christmas. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly, casting a golden glow across the room. The scent of freshly baked cookies and hot chocolate filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of pine from the Christmas tree that stood proudly in the corner, its twinkling lights reflecting off the ornaments. The family had decided to make this Christmas Eve a celebration unlike any other, a celebration of love, resilience, and the bond that had carried them through the storm. They had invited the Carters to join them, and together the two families sat around the fireplace, their faces glowing with joy and gratitude. Buddy, the golden Labrador, who had become the hero of the season, lay stretched out on the rug near the fire, his head resting on his paws. His tail wagged lazily every now and then, as if he could feel the love and warmth radiating from everyone in the room. Mrs. Johnson emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray piled high with cookies, gingerbread men, sugar cookies shaped like stars and Christmas trees, and chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven. She set the tray down on the coffee table, smiling as the children's eyes lit up. "Dig in, everyone," she said, handing a cookie to Lily, who was already reaching for one. "And there's plenty more where that came from." "Thanks, Mom," Lily said, taking a big bite of her gingerbread man. She leaned over and held out a piece to Buddy, who sniffed it curiously before gently taking it from her hand. "You deserve a treat too, Buddy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "You're the best dog in the whole world." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes soft and content. He chewed the cookie slowly, savoring the moment. He didn't need words to understand how much he was loved. Mr. Johnson poured hot chocolate into mugs, topping each one with a generous dollop of whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. He handed the mugs around, making sure everyone had one before settling into his favorite armchair. "This is what Christmas is all about," he said, raising his mug in a toast. "Family, friends, and being together." "To Buddy," Jack said, raising his mug high. "The bravest dog ever." "To Buddy," everyone echoed, their voices filled with warmth and laughter. Buddy lifted his head at the sound of his name, his ears perking up. He barked softly as if to say, "I'm just happy to be here." The evening unfolded in a series of simple, joyful moments. The children played a game of charades, their laughter filling the room as they tried to guess each other's clues. Lily acted out a snowman, hopping around the room with her arms outstretched, while Jack pretended to be a reindeer, complete with imaginary antlers. Even Ethan joined in, his usually reserved demeanor giving way to the infectious joy of the holiday. The adults, meanwhile, shared stories and memories, their voices low and filled with nostalgia. Mr. Carter recounted a Christmas from his childhood when a snowstorm had stranded his family in their cabin for 3 days. "We didn't have much," he said, his eyes twinkling, "but we had each other, and that was enough." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her gaze drifting to Buddy, who was now lying on his back, his paws in the air as Lily rubbed his belly. "That's what this Christmas has reminded me of," she said softly. "It's not about the gifts or the decorations. It's about the people and the pets we love. It's about being there for each other, no matter what." As the night wore on, the families gathered closer around the fire, their voices growing quieter as the warmth and comfort of the evening began to lull them into a peaceful calm. The children curled up on the couch, their eyelids growing heavy, while the adults sipped the last of their hot chocolate, their conversation turning to hopes and dreams for the coming year. Buddy, ever watchful, moved from one family member to the next, nuzzling their hands and resting his head on their laps. He seemed to sense that this was a special moment, one to be cherished. When he finally settled down, it was at the center of the room where he could see everyone. He stretched out on the rug, his golden fur glowing in the firelight, and let out a contented sigh. His family was safe, his home was warm, and his heart was full. As the clock struck midnight, Mr. Johnson stood and cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Before we call it a night," he said, "I just want to say how grateful I am for all of you. This Christmas could have been very different, but because of Buddy and because of our neighbors, we're here together, safe and happy. That's the greatest gift I could ever ask for." Mrs. Johnson smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I couldn't agree more," she said. "This Christmas has reminded me of what really matters. It's not the presents or the decorations, it's the love we share and the memories we create." Lily and Jack nodded, their faces glowing with happiness. "And Buddy," Lily added, looking down at the dog who had become the heart of their family. "He's the best Christmas gift ever." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of his name, his tail thumping against the rug. He didn't understand the words, but he could feel the love in their voices, the warmth in their gazes. He barked softly as if to say, "I love you too." The evening ended with a quiet moment of reflection. The family sat together watching the fire as it burned low, the embers glowing softly in the hearth. Outside, the snow sparkled under the moonlight, a reminder of the storm that had brought them closer together. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the love of family filled the room, creating a memory that would last a lifetime. As the Carters prepared to leave, they hugged the Johnsons tightly, their bond stronger than ever. "Merry Christmas," Mr. Carter said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And thank you for sharing this special night with us." "Merry Christmas," Mrs. Johnson replied, her smile radiant. "And thank you for being there when we needed you most." After the Carters left, the Johnsons lingered by the fire for a little while longer, savoring the quiet magic of the night. Buddy lay at their feet, his eyes half closed, his body relaxed. He had done so much for his family, and now he could rest, knowing that they were safe and happy. As the fire burned down to its final embers, Mr. Johnson looked around the room, his heart full. "This has been the most special Christmas I can remember," he said. "Not because of the gifts or the decorations, but because of the love we've shared." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her hand resting on Buddy's back. "And because of Buddy," she said. "He reminded us of what really matters, love, loyalty, and the strength of family." Lily and Jack leaned down to hug Buddy one last time before heading to bed. "Good night, Buddy," Lily whispered. "We love you." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. He didn't need words to understand how much he was loved. He could feel it in every touch, every smile, every moment of warmth and joy. And as the Johnsons turned in for the night, their hearts full of gratitude and love, the message of the season was clear. Christmas wasn't about the gifts or the decorations. It was about the bonds that held them together, the love that carried them through the hardest times, and the joy of being surrounded by family and friends. For Buddy, and for the Johnsons, this Christmas would always be remembered as the one that truly captured the spirit of the season, a celebration of love, friendship, and the unbreakable bond of family.